I'm thinking there is no way I can follow the Ashley Madison presentation for excitement and engagement. Automotive advertising probably doesn't quite cut it. But when I was talking to Shay just before this session, she said some people have said they're really interested in the methodology that Borrell uses. So I'm going to do two things in this presentation. I will take you through the slides that have been prepared, and I'll say now those were slides that were prepared for a webinar. They to some extent probably require close attention to the numbers, which is difficult in this sort of setting and with numbers thrown up on a screen. So I will have the slides emailed to everyone later because I think they're interesting in themselves, in that they show you in great detail what's been happening and what we think will happening with automotive advertising. But before that, I'll just spend perhaps 4 or 5 minutes talking a little bit about Borrell Associates and the way in which we do our work. Borrell has been around for about 12 years. Some of you will have had some sort of reaction or engagement with the company. 1 or 2 of you may have been to our conferences. A number of you will get our industry reports, and some might actually be clients. As Peter said, we focus first on the US because that's where the company started, and because I'm based in Canada and come from the UK, we've added those 2 countries to those where we provide ad spend estimates and forecasts. We routinely, like several times a week, get asked if we're going to provide similar research for other countries, and the answer is perhaps, but not yet. There is a huge amount of work, and you'll see why in a moment, that goes into the kinds of outputs that we provide. The company has always specialized in local online advertising and the methodology that's needed to understand what advertisers spend, and not just what they spend, but down to a very granular level. We're working with a Canadian client at the moment. They want to go down to the postcode level. They want a national database for all of Canada, but they want to zero in on populations that sometimes will be perhaps just a few hundred. And they want to know within that what each business category is spending, how it's determined by employee cohort. And so you get a sense of, if you're not going to make the numbers up, the kind of research that is needed to generate reliable estimates and reliable forecasts for that kind of geography. It's very easy to say for a country what's happening. If you're dealing with a population of 300 million or even 30 million, you can have a very high degree of accuracy in the numbers that come out. When you're dealing with perhaps a couple of thousand people, it's really, really difficult. And the automotive slides that I'll go through in a moment, I think give you some sense of the depth of the research and the data that goes into it. So I'll probably come back to that in a moment, but let's go through the presentation itself and let's make sure. So we're going to look at a number of things. And when I say look at them, I mean we'll skim, because in the time available, we're not going to get into a great deal of detail. So when we look at what's happening with automotive, we assemble research from multiple sources. We do our own surveys. We survey hundreds of thousands of advertisers every year. We do it in a very structured way. We're trying to group it around the geographies that we're particularly interested in. But what we're asking them is not what they spend, because actually we can get that data from other sources. For instance, in Canada, the Canadian Marketing Association provides very detailed statistics on ad spending. But what we're asking advertisers is, what's going to change? Attitudinally, what's going to change? Where do you see your money going next year, the year after, that it didn't go this year and the year before? By way of example, when we did some work recently for a UK client, they are a regional newspaper group. They operate in 8 distinct markets within the UK. And the surveys that we had sent to their advertisers weren't, as I say, asking about the actual ad spend. What we wanted to get a sense of is, do Do you use mobile? Are you going to? What will be the tipping point that pushes you into that? How will you determine how the 100% of your ad budget fragments across different media over the next few years? I mean, clearly with any forecast, it's only as reliable as what people say at the time you ask the question. But what we saw were very clear differences in how ad spending was going to change over the next, in this case, 3 to 5 years. And when you then looked at those numbers and got a sense of what the demographics of those regions were, the answers to a very high extent did correlate with what you might have expected people to say. So when we look at what's going to happen in the automotive sphere, one of the things we look at is, well, what's happening with vehicle sales? Because although there may be a slight time disconnect between advertising and results, clearly there has to be some sort of correlation. People will not throw huge amounts of money against declining results. So we begin by saying, okay, over the last 10, 12 years, what has happened? And you'll see that what has happened is that sales tracked down. These are US numbers, I should say, very, very slightly between 2001 and 2008, and then they really tanked. And that obviously ties in with what happened to the US economy. And then you have a gradual increase. So the question then really, once you get to 2012, 2013, is what's going to happen after that? Is that number going to continue to go up? Will it get back to where it used to be? Is there anything that's going to bring it down a little bit? And without getting into reasons, what we think is that numbers will continue to climb, but very, very slowly. There'll be a small dip in about 2015, 2016. That to some extent may reflect the fact that there was the upsurge in activity and people haven't yet got to the point of replacing the cars they just bought a year or two earlier. We look at what's happening in dealerships. The number of dealerships is a function of a couple of things. How many cars you have sold, because clearly if you haven't sold very many, a lot of businesses are simply going to go out of business. The manufacturers that own these dealerships will probably pull out of some of them, they'll consolidate others. So again, we look at those numbers to see if there's any obvious trend that may, in due course, give us an indication of where the ad spend's likely to go. Number of used cars dealers is falling, and that one isn't necessarily intuitive. You might expect that when an economy is doing poorly and people are deferring the purchase of a new car, that a used car might make more sense. And perhaps it does, but the number of dealerships is actually declining. Again, it's a factor that will have an impact on advertising once you've got a sense of what typically is spent in advertising to sell a single vehicle. The potential buyer isn't necessarily a dreamer, but it's someone who's thinking about buying a car, and there are various ways in which you can allocate people to that particular category, but a lot more people are thinking about it than actually do it. So you'll see again the trend lines move to some extent in parallel, although there's a gap. There's obviously the gap between the more people think about buying a car than actually buy a car. But what is interesting is that as we come up to 2013, that gap has narrowed considerably. And the question is why? Is it simply, people's dreams have been punctured, or is there something else going on there? What we think is going on, and what comes through from the research we do, particularly with advertisers, and as we look at the numbers, is that the internet is what's making the difference. There is much more engagement between the car buying process and the ability to get your car than was perhaps the case before. People can now do their own research, in other words. So the shape of the thought pattern and the research that goes into getting a new car is very, very different. And we had some clever infographic that took forever to design that tries to show it. I'll put that up in a moment. But what we concluded, and at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that more and more data sources are being factored into the research. So we start with some of our own surveys, we add Scarborough, we add others, as we begin to put a sense together of what's happening in this market from the point of view of estimating the local ad spend and the predictive component, what is going to be spent on advertising to sell cars. And what our research showed was that there is a clear difference between what we've termed here the analog and the digital mindset, but putting it another way, the extent to which people use the internet to do the research. Increasingly, we're finding that the time that people spend on figuring out what car to get has about halved, whereas it used to take 5 or 6 months for someone to get to the point of thinking about it, to actually buying the car. Now we're down to somewhere between 2 and 3 months. As people are able to do their own research online, you can use all of these configurators, for instance, that enable you to build your own car, email the specs through to the dealer, get a quote, sort out your financing. You don't actually have to talk to anyone anymore, whereas a few years ago you had to perhaps move from one dealership to another, depending on the kinds of cars you were interested in. So you're dealing with a shortened approach, a shortened mindset, and this is the infographic. It just depicts it a little bit differently, a sort of filtration process that gets you to your decision at one end and the shot glass on the other. Fewer buyers relying to a large extent on different media to get the information. We have a huge database. We survey about 5,000 media companies on a quarterly or annual basis. They get a very short survey. They often don't understand the significance of the questions we're asking, but they're essentially designed to populate our database and give us a constant flow of statistics that enables us to do our estimating and our forecasting. So again, I'll have the slides sent to you all later, but what it shows is that auto is one of the few ad categories that's actually increasing. Many ad categories have been in decline. This one, despite what happened to auto sales in 2008, has continuously increased. The rate of increase is slowing a little bit, but it's still increasing. But there are movements across the different media. So if you look at the far right-hand column, you'll see that, and again, bear in mind, this is US, where different types of advertising may resonate in different ways. But broadcast TV, decline. Directories, declining. And that's symptomatic of what you're seeing with the directory business in the US anyway. It is struggling to reinvent itself away from a print and into an online environment. Newspapers way down, but that's not really a huge surprise because newspaper advertising generally has been declining at something like 15 to 20% annually for the last 3 years in North America. Borrell did the revenue surveys for the Canadian newspapers, and we used to send the results in each quarter and were asked to sort of sit on them for a few days while people digested how to communicate just how awful the results were. So there's no surprise that newspapers are declining. Others have gone up, surprisingly, although it's a small base. Cinema has gone up. Radio has declined. Online has gone up substantially, though. If you look at the numbers there, they've nearly tripled in the last 3 years. And we'll return to that one in a moment as well. So what's down? Well, that just really summarizes with black or red lettering what was in the previous slide, but it does illustrate the point I was making. These are the categories that are down. And some, as I said, are up. Online is the big winner here. I'm not going to talk about co-op. I mean, if you're interested, it'll be in the slides. It gives you some sense of what the ad spending is. And again, our methodology there draws on all of the same sources. And as I say, those sources are designed at the end of it for us to be able to say, let's take London as an example. What is spent by car dealers on advertising in Southwest 14 postcode of London. So we can take it down to that level of granularity. And this gives you digital ad spending by the different kinds of advertiser in the auto industry. Franchise dealers clearly have the largest slice of the pie there. These are the kinds of digital ad spending, the formats that people are choosing. Online video, very popular, and it makes sense because a car is clearly something that you can try to sell by showing how it performs, what the features of it are. Targeted display, again, it makes complete sense. If people have shown any sort of interest in cars, either previous searches, previous purchases, it makes sense to throw ads at them. The slide looks at what the franchise, the manufacturer-owned dealers are spending. It shows it by year, it shows it by ad category. And again, targeted display clearly moving up there along with video. So from a predictive point of view, you're able to use the data to get a sense of what it is advertisers are most likely to want, and therefore how to frame the sales pitch to those advertisers. Independent dealers, the pattern is much the same. Dealer associations spend very small amounts of money, but again, you can see the two dominant ad categories are the same there as they are for any of the others. We do a lot of benchmarking. Typically, what happens is someone comes along and says, I've been smacked around because my VP thinks that our results are not as good as a competitor newspaper. And what we're able to do, drawing on the database, is say, well, if you're a daily newspaper in a major metro market and you have a circulation of 400,000, this is the range of what you should be doing for different kinds of advertising. This is how much you should be getting per unit of circulation in print. I mean, that's a tricky metric, of course, when you've got print circulation declining. But we can nonetheless do the benchmarking and say for each ad type, this is what you ought to be doing. So this gives you some sense of where the growth has occurred across different media. And overall budgets were up 12.5% in 2012. The slide, which is again drawn from our database, gives the, when I say from our database, from the media companies that report to us what their revenues are from different types of advertising. It gives you a sense over the years of the average. So this takes in newspaper, TV, cable, and radio. And it's not the happiest of pictures. It shows that after what happened in 2008, advertising went up as the industry tried to stimulate sales with some, not huge success, because as we saw from the earlier slide, sales in 2009 were way below what they had been 2 or 3 years previously. And probably as a reaction to that, as the auto companies faced increasing financial difficulties, advertising declined significantly. And it hasn't really gone up very much in the last 4 years. This is online, bear in mind. But it's about the same now in real terms as it was 3 or 4 years ago, and much the same, a little bit more than it was before the 2008 crash. We use the data we have to produce averages of what revenue might be. So for example, if you're a newspaper, and this takes in all types of newspaper, the average online auto revenue per unit of print circulation is just under $10 in the US. And there's a range within that. Generation of online revenue is, to a large extent, a function of the size of the newspaper. And it makes sense. A very small paper serving a small community with a small staff is not just going to bring in less overall than a large major metro, but it's actually less per unit of circulation. For the larger papers, it can be as much as $25 from auto advertising per unit of circulation. And the average percentage of total online revenue that newspapers in the US get from auto is just under 14%. So it's a significant slice of their business. Radio stations, we look at it a little bit differently, but you'll see, although there is quite a lot of radio advertising, the percentage of online that comes from auto is much, much smaller. TV stations, from the online perspective, it's really large. 27% of TV online advertising revenue comes from auto. Cable companies, I mean, you'll get this when I send it out later. And for Auto Trader, obviously, it's pretty much all of it is from auto because that's all they're advertising. We developed a set of recommendations based on the data, and they're self-evident. Educate the dealers, think creatively in how you want to engage with the person who's seeing your advertising. Look at what your competitors are and are not doing and think divergently. So what this shows is a couple of things. It shows that the advertising in auto is surprisingly robust. It shows that it is migrating strongly to online, and that is either a function of or has driven a different approach to how people buy cars. In other words, much closer engagement of the purchaser with the buying process and being able to control it. I mean, the ability to generate multiple quotes, for instance, from dealers owned by the same manufacturer. I mean, you can go online, you can send the request for a quote out to maybe 3 or 4 BMW or Ford dealers, see what they say, you can get quotes on different cars. So you have a much more informed purchaser, and the advertising clearly needs to reflect that growing engagement between the purchaser and the product. And that overall there will be an increase, continued increase, we think, in auto advertising. So I think that probably sums up what I wanted to say, which was both looking at the numbers around auto advertising, the shifts and changing patterns as to how cars are advertised, and also the methodology that goes into the way in which we develop estimates. I've shown you national estimates, but if someone said, in this US zip code, how do these numbers break out, we would be able to do that. Reliability obviously gets slightly weaker the smaller the base, the population base that you're working with. But the numbers that we produce are then used by media companies particularly to try and figure out what they ought to be getting in any particular business category of advertising. So I will stop there because I think I've probably bumped up against my time.